So today's webinar will cover the installation of our IDTECK standard software, SQL Server, and other basic configuration. Let's get started. First of all, this is the materials that we are going to cover today. Basic installation requirement, SQL Server Installation, IDTECK standard installation, communication server configuration, and additional functions for COM servers. So let's get started. The first, basic installation requirement. You can see all the minimum system requirements from this chart right here. Operating system, Windows 7, 8, 8.1, and Windows 10. Also, Windows Server 2003, Windows Server 2008, 2008 R2, 2012, and it's R2. There's a minimum requirement for CPU, RAM, hard drive, and database. As we already know, SQL Server, Microsoft SQL Server must be installed before installing our software. There's one thing that you have to note it. If you're using Windows 7, 8, or 8.1, it's okay to use SQL Server 2008. However, if you're utilizing Windows 10, then it must be either 2012 version or higher. Also, there are many different types of versions for our software. For Windows 7, 8, and 8.1, it's okay to use lower version. However, for Windows 10, the version of our software must be either 3.31 or higher. SQL Server Installation. As I just mentioned, SQL Server must be installed initially and prior to installing our software. I'm just going to go over what the SQL Server is. I believe most of you already know this, but SQL Server is basically the database management system created by Microsoft. And how does it work with our software? Our software actually uses this as its database storage. All existing data will be stored in the database of SQL Server. So what we're going to do from now is we're going to go over step by step of how to install SQL Server. If you have any questions, you can always type in at any time. I've mentioned this so many times before from the previous webinar, but I'm just going to say it one more time. All the questions and answers will be compiled and also will be emailed to you. So let's try installing SQL Server. This is the version that I'm going to use to cover today's webinar. It's the newest version, which is 3.03.05. I'm not quite sure how many of you already have tried installing our software, but if you're using Windows 10, the problem was that you had to download and install SQL Server separately. The reason for that is because in our installer file, we only had 2008 version of SQL Server embedded. However, this new installer, which is 3.305, will have 2014, SQL Server 2014 in there. So from now on, there's going to be less hassle for you to download and install the SQL Server separately, even if you're using Windows 10. So let's get started. This is the installer that I'm going to use right here. Let's double click it. So it's taking a little bit time right here. The first screen that you're going to see, the message pop-up, is that you have to select the language. There are two types of language, Korean and English. Of course, I'm going to choose English for now, and let's click OK. By the way, let me give you one information. This new installer that has 2014 version of SQL in it will be released by next week. So after next week, you'll be able to download from our website. So after running the installer, it's going to start processing the installation, and this is the first message box that you're going to see. It's going to take approximately about 5 to 7 minutes to install the actual application. However, if there's no SQL Server already installed on your computer, then installation of SQL Server might take longer. We assume it to be around 15 to 20 minutes sometimes. It actually depends. It actually varies, but depends on the computer specs and everything. But normally, installation of SQL Server will take about 15 to 20 minutes and 5 to 7 minutes for the actual application. Here we go. Welcome to the Install Shield wizard for IDTECK Standard Server. Let's click Next. For the setup type, you will have 3 different options. First, Windows Installer 4.5. Second, Microsoft.NET Framework 3.5 Service Pack 1. And the third, SQL Server 2014. As I mentioned before, we used to have 2008 version in it, but now from the new installer, there's going to be 2014 version in it. So what we need is, we actually need all of this. So let's check all of this and click Next. This is the next screen that you're going to see. Instance name and SA password. If you have already used SQL Server, you'll know what the instance is, but I'll just basically go over it simply. Instance is a set of memory structure that manages database file. This actually manages data associated with the database. And what is the SA? It's simply just the default admin account for the SQL Server. You'll have 2 options here, default installation and custom installation. We recommend to use the default installation. Instance name and the login password are already given to you, and you can freely change this at any time. But for now, we're just going to leave it as it is. Instance name as IDTECK, login password as 1234. Of course, the login name will be SA. So let's leave it as it is and click next. It's going to start installing the Microsoft SQL Server 2014. This will take some time, as I said, around approximately 15 to 20 minutes, but it actually depends. So let's see how long it takes. As you can see, it's taking some time, but it'll be finished eventually, so please bear with me. Meanwhile, let me just explain to you just one thing. Of course, there are two types of installer, 32-bit and 64-bit. I believe you already know this. This is just really simple information. So if you're utilizing 32-bit OS, make sure to download and install 32-bit installer. Otherwise, 64. You already know 64-bit OS. It utilizes larger amount of RAM more effectively than 32-bit, so it'll be faster. Most of the computers these days will have 64 version of OS already installed, so it's really simple to check. If you have any question, please feel free to type in at any time. While we are waiting for the SQL Server, the Express version to be installed, let me just read some of the questions that we received. One of the questions that we received is, can we upgrade from SQL 2012 to 2014? What will happen to existing database? Nothing. Actually, answer is nothing's going to happen. You can always upgrade from the lower version of SQL to the higher version at any time. Upgrading from the lower version to the higher version won't affect any database file. Another question that we received is, can we run the installer in Linux? No. As I showed you here, this is the basic requirement. The only operating system that is fully compatible with our software is Windows 7, 8, 8.1, and 10. Also, here, Windows Server 2003, 2008, and 2012. It's not going to work on either Linux or Mac OS. So this is the part that actually takes some time, but please bear with me. It's not going to take that long. It normally takes about 15 to 20 minutes, but it actually depends on the computer specs and everything. The computer that I'm using right now actually has pretty high spec, so it'll be quick. It'll be done quickly. Meanwhile, let me just ask you something. How many of you already have tried installing our software? You can just type yes at the question box, or you can just raise your hand by clicking the button there. If you already have installed and used our software, please either type yes or just click the button to raise your hand. We have 2, 3, 4. Any more? 5. That's nice. So those of you who did not raise your hand or who did not type in yes are new customers or sleeping. If you're sleeping, please wake up and concentrate. Thank you. Okay, we are almost done, so please bear with me. I said this bunch of times, but let me just say it one more time. Let me just say it. The questions and answers will be compiled. We're going to gather it together, compile it, and send it over to you via email. That way you can see what kind of questions were asked, how those questions were answered. It'll basically help your understanding. Almost done. It's not too far from being completed, so please be patient. And please type in your questions whenever you have some. And it actually takes a little bit of time for us to type in the answers. So once you ask the questions, please be patient until we actually answer your questions. We will try to answer all of your questions. It's almost done. Please be patient. So always remember, we always recommend to choose default installation instead of custom installation. When you choose default installation, the instance name and the password will be given to you. However, you can always change those. Right now we used IDTECK as our instance name and 1234 for our password. There you go. You can see it from here. So you actually have to remember this because you have to use this information later on. There. So SQL Server installation has been completed. And from here, it actually runs over to the actual application installation. Standard installation. Once you click Next, you will be directed to input some informations, the instance name and the password, and choose options. There are three components to consider after the installation. First, config.exe, config file. Second, communication server. And the third, application. So what is config.exe? It's just a configuration tool for the database. You can actually use it to test the connection to the database, whether it's successfully connected or not. ComServer. This is the tool that lets the software to communicate to all existing devices. Lastly, application is simply IDTECK software. So let's see it. From the first screen, you have to enter your username and the company name. In this case, I will put Chase Kim. Company name, of course, IDTECK. On the bottom section, it says, install this application for anyone who uses this computer or only for me. It really doesn't matter what to choose. So but we usually just leave it as it is. Anyone who uses this computer. So let's leave it as it is and click Next. Select features. As you can see, there are three features. IDTECK Standard Database, IDTECK Communication Server, and IDTECK Standard Server. We need all these three. So let's check all this and click Next. On the next screen, you have to type in your database server name. In this case, it's already given to you. And as you can see here, it says IDTECK, which was my instance name, which was automatically given to me when I first selected default installation option. Connect using, you have two options, Windows Authentication or SQL Server Authentication. Remember, you always have to choose SQL Server Authentication. Do not choose Windows Authentication. So connection type, always choose the second option, which is SQL Server Authentication. Login ID, default admin account. Password. What did we use before? When we selected default installation, the password was already given to us, which was 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is why I told you that you have to remember those information. And if you happen to change those information, then always make sure to write it down before proceeding to the next step. So, instance name is given, login ID, and the password. Let's click Next. From this point, it's really simple. You just have to click Next, Next, Next. That's all you have to do. Next, Next. And then it'll eventually start installing the software. Let's see what kind of question you have asked. feel free to type in your questions whenever you want to. So the installation will take about 5 to 7 minutes maximum. Or shorter than that. Make sure to run as administrator. Right-click the desktop shortcut, go to Properties, go to Compatibility tab, and check the box next to Run this program as an administrator. What this means is that after installation is completed, you will have 3 different desktop icons, which are Config, Communication Server, and the application. You have to click each one of them. Right-click it, go to Properties, go to Compatibility tab, and you have to check the box to run this program as an administrator. Once the installation is completed, I will show you this. There you go. The installation has been completed. Let's click Finish. As you can see, we have 3 different desktop icons here. Let me put this in order. IDTECK Standard Config, which is a config exe that I talked about. The Communication Server, and the actual application, IDTECK Standard Server. So what is mean by this is that right-click the desktop shortcut, go to Properties, go to Compatibility tab, and check to run this program as an administrator. This means that basically you have to right-click each one of them, go to the Properties, go to the Compatibility tab, and check the box next to where it says Run this program as an administrator. There. Apply. Okay. So this one's done. Let's do this. Right-click, Properties, Compatibility tab, and check to run this as an administrator. This one's done. And same thing for this. Right-click, Properties, Compatibility tab, check. Apply. Okay. There you go. That's all you have to do right after the installation. So as I mentioned, config, this one, is the tool for the database. I mean, you can, once you double click it, the little window will appear with your database information. Host, which is the instance name, database name, login name, and the password. IDTECK, that's what we used for our instance. Database name is already given to you automatically. Username is SA, of course, and the password. What did we use during the installation of SQL Server and the application? We used 1, 2, 3, and 4. You just got to type that in and click this connection test button. Success to connect to the database. Click OK. This is what it does. You actually have to run this to test the connection to the database after entering correct information. This is all you have to do for this. So let's put it aside. Next, communication server. Double click it. Boom, there you go. This is the basic interface that you're going to see for our communication server. From here, you also have to do a little bit of configuration. I will go over that right now. When you look at the left portion here, you'll see 4 different options. Server setup, device setting, restart server, and of course, a button you can press to exit the program. What you have to do is first, click the server setup. Then you'll have this window. When you look at the left side, you also see database, use site, and the server. Click database. Then you'll see all this information. Doesn't this look similar to what you have just seen from config.exe? There you go. It's exactly the same. There, database name, and the username. What you have to do is after running the config file, you just have to enter the exact same information on the communication server also. So let's go back and try it again. Once you open the communication server, click the server setup, click database, and enter the correct information. The information that you used for a config file. So let's type in the password. Everything else is the same. IDTECK, database name IDTECK STD, which means IDTECK standard. Username SA, and the password. We used, of course, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Click OK. Then you will be prompted to restart the communication server. When you do, click Yes to restart. There you go. This is all you have to do to configure communication server. Basically, you just have to input correct information for your database. And the information that you have to use for this communication server configuration is as exactly same as the information that you used for the config file, which is this. Now let's see what kind of questions you have asked. Let's see. Okay, one of the questions that we received was, this new software can support all the legacy controller and reader. Okay, the older boards will still be compatible with our latest software. That's it. There are maybe some new functions that may not be available, but we will notify you if there is. And any more questions? Please ask us so we can answer your questions. Oh, one of the questions was how to backup, which means how to back up the database. Actually, this was covered from the first webinar, partially, but you can always go into our software and there's a backup option there. You can always use that. However, in this webinar, we are only covering installation and the initial setting. So this won't be covered from this webinar. However, we will be covering this from the next webinar. But remember, you can always go into the software. There's a option that you can restore and back up the database. So always remember 3 components to consider: config exe, communication server, and the application. And always make sure to run them as an administrator. Communication server configuration. This is what we just did. But I'm just going to go over one more time. Communication server is a tool which lets the software to communicate with all connected devices. How it does? The communication actually goes in this order: A, S, L, S, A. A stands for the communication server. S stands for IDTECK application, which is our software eventually. And L, the loop. We call it loop. However, it means the devices. So whenever the system starts to communicate each other, it starts from the communication server, A, and it gets passed on to the software and then the devices. After that, it goes back from the devices to the software and then back to the communication server. So this is the actual order for the communication process. This chart actually describes you how to configure config file, which I've just covered. Run it, type in the correct information. Most likely, host, database, username will be given to you automatically based on the information that you entered during the installation of SQL Server and the actual application. Only thing you have to actually type in is your password. So remember your password, the password that you use when you start installing the SQL. The application. Whenever you select default installation, the password will be given to you. However, you can always change it. And if you happen to change it, always remember. This is the part that I covered, but let me go over it one more time. Once you open communication server, go to the server setup, select database, and then it actually says fill out IP address of database. However, if database, the SQL server, is installed on the same computer that has the software and the communication server, then you don't really have to type in the IP address. You just have to put local / your instance name. For example, right here, I didn't type in IP address here. Instead, I just localized it. If the database is installed on the same computer that has the software and communication server, then you can just type in like this. You can localize it. Now, I'm going to cover additional functions that you can see and use from the communication server. When you first open the communication server, there are 3 different tabs that you can see. Packet Event tab, Loop Info tab, and the Current Client tab. Let's see how it looks. There you go. Packet Event tab, Loop Info, and the Current Client tab. Now, what these do is Packet Event tab. From the Packet Event tab, you can see all the polling process. It displays all the current polling process. For example, one that I mentioned here, A to S, S to L, L to S, and back to A. This kind of process will be displayed from this tab. Loop Info. If you create loop within our software, all the existing loop information will be displayed here, will be listed out here. Loop 1, Loop 2, Loop 3, or Loop 100, whatever you have will be listed out here so you can see easily. Current Client. This will display all the existing devices and the site. It displays the status of packet transmission for the registered devices, and it's actually skipped here, but we have to include the site. For example, let's say you have created 2 different sites, and each site has 4 devices registered to it. Then you'll have a total of 8 devices. So the status of the packet transmission for 2 sites and total of 8 devices will be displayed from this tab, Current Client tab, right here. Of course, right now we haven't set up anything yet, so you're not going to see anything right now. It's just empty. But once you set up something from our software, basically, you will see everything here. If you have any questions, please feel free to type in. Once again, all the questions and answers will be compiled and it'll be shared with you. It'll eventually help your understanding by reviewing these questions and answers. A lot of you have asked so many different questions right now. Let me just read one of the questions that we just received. It says, can in the future change the user login and password of the database? Of course, the answer is yes. However, you will need to do with SQL Server Management Studio. This is one that you can always download from the web. You have to use SQL Server Management Studio in order to change user login and password later. But always make sure that it matches to the setting within the communication server. Instance name, IDTECK, with the SA credential, and point to it when asked. That was one of the questions. Yes, usually the the answer is usually yes. Any more questions? Okay, let's continue. There is one thing that I would like to show you. This was actually covered from the first webinar, but it's actually also related to the basic configuration of the communication server. So I would like to show you right now. You remember that we went into server setup and database to enter the information here. We clicked OK. The system asked you to restart the computer, whether you want to restart the computer, and we clicked yes. The second option that you see is the use site. When you click it, you'll see this information: site ID and the site list. All the sites that you actually create within our software will be numbered from 1 to whatever. When you actually go into our software, let's try to go into it. This is the shortcut. Let's double click. Light version. This is the light version. Light version is limited with 500 users and 10 doors. You'll get this message if you haven't purchased the dongle key. But if you purchase a dongle key, it'll be changed. You'll no longer see this message because it's going to be unlimited. Let's click OK. Default login ID, admin, and also admin for the password. Now, server setup, use site. So whenever you create the site within our software, all the sites will be numbered from 1 through whatever. And on the site list section, it says 1 default site, which means, let's go to the site setting. And let's click this little arrow button here. There you go. The default site is already given to you, of course, as a default. So this is the automatic given site to you, which is numbered as 1. So this is the first site that you're going to see. That's why it's numbered as 1. Now, you have two options. Let's say you want to create one site. You can either modify this default site. Let's say you can change the name to test site. And you can enter the IP address of the server. Now this computer has the software and the database. So IP address of this computer will be the site IP address. So what is my IP address? Let's see. Right now this computer is using 192.168.1.78. So 192.168.1.78. This is the first option you can take, which is modifying the default site. Default site, which is site number 1. Site number 1, default site, you can always modify by changing the name and the IP address. This way, your site number of your site will still be 1, because default site was site number 1 and you just modified it. You don't really have to worry about site number and everything. However, what if you create an extra site? Instead of modifying the default site, which is the first site with site number 1, what if you actually create the new site? Let's click New. Do you want to perform new write? Click Yes. Now, you want to create a new site? Let's create one. New site. 192.168.1.78. Let's click Connection Test. The site is connected. Click OK. And of course you have to save it by clicking the Save button. Ta-da! There you go. What does this information window say? It says to enable the registered site, go to Communication Server Setting, Site Setting, and change the site ID to 2. Which means, let's go back to the site setting here and click this little arrow button. There, you already have given site, which is a default site with site number 1. However, you actually have created another site named as new site with your server IP address. Then what would the site number be for this site? Obviously, this is the second site after default site, so it will be numbered as 2. Then, always remember to go back to the communication server, go to the server setup, go to the use site, and try to restart it. You can actually restart it from here too by clicking this Restart Server. Now, communication server has been restarted. Let's go back to server setup and use site. Ta-da! There you go. Default site with site number 1 and the new site. I named it as new site with site number 2. If you want to use this second site, new site, instead of the default site, let's say, oh, I just want to leave this default site as it is. But I'll just create one here, and let's just use this. Let's say you want to do this. Then make sure to go back to communication server, server setup, use site, and then change this server IP. Server site ID. Instead of 1, you want to use 2, new site. So change this. And then click OK to restart. There you go. You have 2 different sites registered within the software. 1, default site, given site, and 2, new site, which we have just created. And I want to use this new site instead of the default site. Then I just have to put this number here. Make sure you do this whenever you decide to create the new site. If you happen to create another one here, what would the site ID be? Obviously 3. Another one, 4. Another one, 5. And it goes on. That's why I said whenever you create sites within our software, it'll be numbered from 1 through whatever. If you have 100 sites, you'll have 100 sites listed here, from 1 through 100. If you want to use site 98, then put 98 here. If you want to use site 50, then put site 50 here. This is what I wanted to show you. This was actually covered from the first webinar, but this is actually kind of important because we personally get a lot of tech support requests in regards to this matter. So I just wanted to cover this one more time. Any questions? Please feel free to type in. Okay, we just have one question. Why would I want to create another site? Obviously, what if you have multiple sites? For example, let's say you have one headquarters in the US, another branch in the Middle East, and the third branch in South America, for example. Then each of those locations will be considered as sites. So headquarters will be the first site, the branch office in the Middle East will be the second site, and the last branch office that you have in the South America will be the third site. Which the database will be managed at in the headquarters in the US. Then you just have to create multiple sites. That can be the example to answer that question. So there are some occasions that you have to create multiple sites. So in order to prepare that, always remember to change site ID from the communication server. Please feel free to ask questions so that we can answer. And obviously, the initial setting, basic setting within our software was already covered from the first webinar, and that will not be covered today. So if you want, you can always go to www.idtech.com and watch the video again. We actually record all these webinars and post it on our website, so you can always go back and watch it again. Any more questions? Please ask. And I know that I said this a bunch of times, but let me just say it for one last time. Questions that we receive and the answers provided to you will be compiled, and what do? Guess. We will email it to you so that you can check what kind of questions were asked and how those were answered. Okay. It seems like you don't have any more questions, but if you do, please email us. For additional questions and concerns, please contact us via tech support at idtechglobal.com. And if you have some sales inquiries, contact us via sales@idtech.com or sales@idtechglobal.com. So this will be it for today. We'll wrap up here. Thank you very much, very much for joining today's webinar. And I really hope to see all of you guys soon. Good night and see you next time. Thank you very much.